get it recording. Okay, so again, just to briefly introduce Dr. Erin Baerwald. She is currently a professor at the University of Northern British Columbia, and her specialty is she studies migratory bats, migratory bat ecology, and conservation issues and topics surrounding them, including and most predominantly that of wind energy. So with that, I'm going to let her take the floor and lead us off this morning. Oh, Erin, you're still muted.
Good morning or afternoon. It is very early here in Northern British Columbia. Dana, you're going to have to share my and enable me to share my screen, please, and thank you. So it's still night. So as a bat person, it's a little early, but we can do this.
Erin, do you actually know how to let me share? Oh, that should have done it.
Okay. There we go. Thank you indeed. Excellent. Boop, boop, boop. Again, good morning. Yeah, good morning, all. I was asked to speak today about a issue that's near and dear to my heart that I've been studying for about 20 years, and present it just as a basic crash course. Many of you have seen some of these slides before. It is a introduction to the issue of bats and wind energy. And really, I want to touch on some of the pros and cons of wind energy as a whole and why we as bat conservationists are concerned. Now, much of what I'm going to say, the bulk of what I'm going to say, is from a North American perspective, because that's where I'm from. I'm currently coming to you today from the actual traditional and ancestral and unceded lands of the Kitley people, where I have the privilege to live, work, and play. So again, this kind of North American perspective on this issue. But many of the things that I'm going to talk about are global in sort of patterns, and we can apply some of what we know here to the same issue around the globe. So I'm going to start off by, I said that this was a wicked problem. So a crash course in a wicked problem. Well, what's a wicked problem? A wicked problem is an idea that there are various different types of problems that we can tackle in environmental sciences and conservation, could be in business, could be in health sciences, kind of whatever a complex issue would be. We can have simple problems which are easy to solve, clear problem with a clear solution, and the sort of properties around it's pretty predictable. You know what the problem is, it's pretty straightforward or obvious. You can get increasingly more complex, that it resists solving. There are more pieces and more interoperating parts. And then we can have this wicked problem, which resists defining. And it's a problem or situation that is not really well understood, and the dynamics of it might keep shifting every time we try to define them. Often this is ambiguous, chaotic, many different stakeholders with many different perspectives. A lot of the elements are just hidden and unknown, the whys and the hows, for example. There's no clear right or wrong solution, and it's really not quantifiable in lots of ways. And importantly, is often there's no precedent. It's never been seen before. How do we tackle this? So this is straight from an issue of conservation biology, this figure, and pretty clear, defines it. But when I think about a wicked problem, I think about it more like this. I think about, we have this wicked problem. In this case, it may be the need to build out wind energy, our need to reduce our fossil fuel consumption to help reduce the effects of climate change. Sounds great. We need that, but we also need to reduce the environmental impacts of that. We know that any source of energy production will have costs. Well, what kind of costs are they? And can we reduce those costs? Sometimes those costs end up being a bit of a wicked problem where we have a need, we have an issue. And in this case, we may have a technology issue, we may have some infrastructure issues, and we may have some economic issues, and then we have some environmental issues that may clash up with politics, values, and cultures. And it's kind of a tangled mess to untangle. Wind energy has been increasing. It's one of the fastest sources of energy, fastest growing sources of energy around the globe. So here we just have kind of, it started in early 2000s, but really took off in about 2010, where we start to see this mass increase, almost exponential growth globally since then. And so here we just have a graph of megawatts on the y-axis and year on the x-axis. And we see that we may have started with a couple 100,000 megawatts in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, but by now, 10 years later, we have about 1 million megawatts. Now, 1 million megawatts is 1,000 gigawatts, just to do some conversions for you, because we go back and forth. So it's growing really rapidly around the world. Not the same everywhere. So here are some predictions of what we are likely to see as growth going forward over the next 10 years. And these are predictions grounded on the current rate of development, as well as on political policies and subsidies that we are seeing as more and more countries are embracing both a need for more power and a need for green power, and trying to transition away from many of those fossil fuel sources of power. So here we see mass growth. China is actually the world leader currently in the amount of currently installed wind energy, but they're predicted in the next 10 years to add 670 more gigawatts in the next 10 years. So that's 670,000 megawatts, followed by the United States, which is predicted to put 140 to 160 more gigawatts into the ground over the next 10 years, all the way down to where I am in Canada, 14th, we're expected to put another about 20 gigawatts in the ground over the next 10 years. So again, this massive amount of growth as there's a bigger and bigger push to get away from fossil fuels. Now, just to put some of this into perspective, it can be easy, I think, to be like, well, I don't know what 1 million megawatts look like, or I don't know really what 4 gigawatts looks like. What is this? Well, just to kind of put it in perspective for you, the average capacity of new land-based turbines are about 3 to 4 megawatts apiece. If we talk about the installation or the predictions in the US over the next 10 years, they said about 160 gigawatts, so 160,000 megawatts. If we assume that they're mostly 3 megawatt turbines, then this is an addition of about 53,000 more turbines on the ground in the US over the next 10 years. I know that there's some industry folks here. This is a wild oversimplification, but just, I think it helps us.
Erin,
Thank
so
you.
sorry.
Yes.
I accidentally muted you by accident. My fault.
I got it. Am I back now?
Mm-hmm.
Looks like I am. Okay. So again, wildly overly simplified. There's lots of complexities about this, but I think it does help kind of visualize these numbers that we may not all deal with on a daily basis, megawatts and gigawatts. To also help you visualize, I really like this image that if we were trying to go back to the future, if we were to have a DeLorean, we would need 1.2 gigawatts of power in a very short period of time to do that. So we would need about 403 3 megawatt wind turbines to produce that sort of power. Now, that all sounds great. For the most part, I think that the vast majority of people, when they think of transitioning from fossil fuels to a greener energy source, it's a good thing. And for the most part, it really is. So here we have on the y-axis the amount of emissions over the life cycle, the amount of emissions produced, CO2 emissions by the energy source. And most of these data come from sort of a life cycle analysis. How much carbon is produced in the production of the facility, or the production of the wind turbines themselves, the installations of them, the operating of them, and the decommissioning of them. And here we have, at the lowest, we have about 9, this is grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt that's produced. So here at hydroelectric, so dams, very low amounts of carbon dioxide produced in the production of electricity from hydroelectric, all the way up to coal and lignite, where we have 1,000 to 1,100 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour or per kilowatt. And here we have wind at a very low amount of carbon dioxide that is being produced per kilowatt hour. So for every hour of energy produced, very low amount of carbon dioxide emissions. Now, of course, this is just one aspect of an environmental impact of energy production. We're here, when we put in wind, we put in any of these other sorts of electrical producing facilities, there's the associated power lines that go in with it. There are associated road access ways. There's mining for some of the components. There's the production of those components. Most wind turbines are fiberglass, so not a lot of mining for rare minerals there. There may be in some of the magnets and the battery storages, but not every wind turbine has those sorts of systems. So the amount of environmental impacts of each type of wind energy or wind turbine does vary. But overall, when we think about some of the environmental impacts, wind has one of the lowest environmental impacts. Very little water is produced during, for example, very little water is produced during the production of the turbines themselves. So overall, it's a good thing. It's a win-win, right? We have some land conversion as well, but most wind energy sites, particularly in North America, are going on to places that are already agriculture. So there's a multi-use sort of system. However, every sort of energy production does have a cost. And one of the biggest costs of wind energy are bat fatalities. A decade ago, a colleague of mine at Arnett and I tried to understand how many bats had been killed kind of in that first 10 years, from 2000 to 2011, the first push of wind energy in North America, trying to understand how many bats may have been killed by those facilities. And we estimated cumulatively that just across US and Canada, from 2000 to 2011, between 840 and 1.7 million bats had been killed in those first 10 years of production. Now, that is just those first 10 years of production. So that, of course, this number is now about 10 years old. So what do we know has happened since then? Or what do we think that has happened since then? Well, we have a variety of fatality estimates that have been connected across North America. And I have an asterisk here because these data are from Canada and the US. Data from Mexico is much harder to obtain and hasn't been included in these analyses. So there's a couple of different data sources here. A few years ago, I looked at the data at the American Wind Wildlife Information Center. It's now Renewable Energy Wildlife Center. And they had pulled together all of this bat data across the US. And they estimated that 2.66 bats per megawatt per year had been killed by wind energy facilities. That's the median. Now, at that time, in October 2020, there was about 110,000 megawatts installed. If we do some rough math, it's about 290,000 bats killed per year across the US. And again, this is probably a wild oversimplification with some biases, but it starts to give us in a realm of possibility. So a few 100,000 bats killed per year in the US. When we look at Canada, Zimmerling and Francis in 2016 also did this sort of estimate, but they looked at it as bats per turbine per year, and they estimated 11.4 bats per turbine per year were killed in Canada. And around this time in 2020, there are 13,000 megawatts, or about 6,700 turbines installed as of October 2020. Now that would be about 77,000 bats killed per year in Canada. So if we combine those, we're looking at a few 100,000, about 400,000 to 500,000 bats killed per year across just the US and Canada. Okay, so we start to see that there's these annual estimates of fatality. And of course, it varies year to year and it varies by site to site, but it puts us in a ballpark. Now, those fatalities aren't distributed equally, either across the landscape or across species. We've seen that 25 of the 47 possible bat species that occur in Canada and the US have been killed by wind energy facilities. But the fatalities are primarily those of open air foragers and primarily during autumn. So these are things that may fly fast in the open. A lot of these aerial hawking insectivores, we do have some frugivores, and we do have some other species as well, but mostly they're these open air foragers. And we actually see this pattern across the globe. When we look across Europe, we have lots of nyctilis. We have lots of those, lots of these migratory species, lots of pipistrelles, lots of movements of those, lots of Tiderata in different places. And so in temperate regions where there may be seasonal migrations, we see a lot of the fatalities centered around autumn when there's these big movements. In less temperate regions, in more tropical areas or where there may be less seasonal variation, we see fatalities distributed more equally across the year. But here in North America, we have these open air foragers predominantly during autumn. Again, in North America, we have these fatalities are dominated by 3 species of migratory tree roosting bats, about 74% if we look at the numbers from across the US and Canada. 19% of all those fatalities are of silver-haired bats, Lasionycterus noctivagans. 23% of the fatalities are eastern red bats, Lasiaris borealis. And about 32% of all of the bat fatalities across US and Canada are of hoary bats, Lasiaris cinereus. Again, but these fatality rates are really highly variable across the continent, and it varies across different landscape types and landscape features. It also varies with turbine height. We have seen multiple studies that have come out that said as turbines are increasing in height, bat fatalities are also increasing. And there may be some sort of leveling off of that, but we know that some of the older, shorter turbines had fewer fatalities than some of these larger, newer, taller turbines. And again, a recent study had just came out looking at that again. And so we also know that across the continent, we see variation based on landscape type. So here we have these estimated bat fatalities per megawatt on the y-axis, and this is the Fish and Wildlife Service region of the US. We have broken down by this Midwest region, lots of agriculture and farmland sort of there, mountain prairie. We have a mix of mountain and prairie and grasslands. Northeast, a lot of these deciduous forested sorts of areas, lots of urban areas as well. The Pacific, much more heavily forested sorts of regions. The Pacific Southwest, much more desert sorts of arid regions, similar to the Southwest. And so overall, we see variation within sites. So we see higher levels of fatalities in some regions, like this Midwest or Northeast. But you should see from these box plots a lot of these variations amongst sites. Some sites with really high fatality rates, and some sites with very, very low fatality rates overall. And so it's not just not every facility has high fatality rates, not every turbine kills bats, not every facility kills bats, but some facilities kill lots, and we still don't fully understand why. Some of the reasons that we have really high cumulative fatality rates in some areas, the highest level of cumulative fatality rates are actually in the prairies. You can see my cursor here, but in the prairies of North America. And now that's mostly because that's where the vast majority of wind energy is installed in North America. So of course, but we see a lot of patterns of where there are lots of wind energy facilities installed. We see cumulatively more bats killed in that region, not necessarily on a turbine by turbine or megawatt by megawatt basis, but overall, it is a cumulative impact. And we do see that there is a variation across the landscape of where wind energy is currently installed and where there is room for more installments. as wind turbines are becoming more and more efficient, so able to operate at lower and lower wind speeds, this opens up new markets where the wind speeds haven't traditionally been harvested, where wind hasn't been harvested, such as the southeast region of the United States here, where we have Florida and Georgia, Louisiana, these sorts of areas where it wasn't feasible to put wind energy facilities in before, but it is now. So just some of the examples across species as well, when we talk about the vast majority, or 74% of fatalities, are of 3 species of migratory bats. This does vary across the country. So Mexican free-tailed bats, or Tiderida brasiliensis, makes up 10% of all fatalities in the US, but it's not present here in 3 of the 6 Fish and Wildlife Service regions. But where it is present, in the Southwest, for example, in the Pacific Southwest, it can make up half of the fatalities that they find. So when we talk about fatalities, I tend to focus on hoary bats as a cumulative sort of thing where we see this big pattern of 32% overall. But within certain regions, those fatalities can be dominated by other species, like Tiderida brasiliensis, where we also have tricolored bats, Perimyotis flavus, that make up 5% of fatalities within the northeastern region, but they make up 0.4% of fatalities within sort of this northern Allegheny Plateau ecoregion. So if we split that up a little bit more, but within that sort of northeast region, we see this variation of 0.4% in some locations, but 11.4% in other ecoregions within that larger region. So even as we start to split up, we see these differences among sites and among ecoregions. We don't have full explanations of why that happens. Lots of hypotheses about it, about seasonal movement patterns or distance to maternity sites or hibernation sites, but we still don't have clear understanding. Some of these species have other impacts, environmental impacts as well, or may have other threats, such as the tricolored bat, which they are impacted by white nose syndrome, but they make up 5% overall of fatalities. The turbines, little brown myotis, historically made up 7% of fatalities, whereas the northern long-eared myotis makes up less than 0.1% of fatalities at turbines historically. And I say historically because when white nose has affected these species so heavily that we were finding them less and less frequently at facilities. There's fewer and fewer of them available to be killed, so fewer and fewer of them are being killed. So why are we concerned about these fatalities? Does it matter how many bats are being killed? Does it matter that a few 100,000 bats are killed across the continent every year? Well, it matters because most species have little or no protections. And so unlike in Europe, where bats are very heavily protected, across North America and indeed across many other continents, species have very little protection. And if they do have protections, it's very piecemeal. Across Canada, bats are protected at provincial levels. Across the US, they're protected at state levels. So they could be protected in one state, but not another, not until they become endangered across the entire country. Then we start to have more cohesive policies and protections in place. Currently, most of the species impacted are not protected, or protected again in this piecemeal sort of fashion. And we know that fatalities come from very large catchment areas. A lot of work done in Germany suggests that the bats being killed there are coming from thousands of kilometers away. We see the same sort of thing here in North America with work done here, that bats collected at a facility, when we look at the stable isotopes of their fur or chemical composition of their fur, they're coming from hundreds to thousands of kilometers away in many cases. And so it's not a local problem, it's a much larger regional or continental scale sort of problem. We know that turbines are killing prime breeding age adults. They're not just killing young, dumb juveniles that may not make it through their first year anyway. They're killing individuals that are actively breeding, which has different implications for population declines and population recovery than it would if they were younger individuals that may have been expected to die in their first year anyway. And this is important because bats have slow life histories where they live a long time and reproduce really slowly. So if we start removing those prime breeding age adults, it can very quickly negatively affect population growth rates and recovery potential. And we have some evidence that bat populations worldwide and in North America specifically are already declining. We see a decline in aerial insectivores around the globe. A lot of these aerial insectivores, nighthawks and swifts and swallows, and flycatchers, are some of the groups of birds that we've seen the largest declines, 50 to 90% in the last 50 years. A lot of this can be associated with habitat loss, pesticide use, and declining insect abundance. Well, many of the species in North America are also insectivores, and many of the species being killed by turbines around the bat species being killed by turbines around the world are also insectivores. So it stands to reason that if we have these declines in aerial insectivores, such as swift swallows, nighthawks, flycatchers, that we also are seeing a parallel decline in aerial hawking insectivorous bats. When we look at the potential impact of wind energy on hoary bats and try to model this, it's challenging. We don't have a lot of demographic data about a lot of the species that are being impacted, but we can try to model it based on our best available knowledge. And indeed, we did this a few years ago, a study led by Winifred Frick, led by the US Fish and Wildlife Service, through an expert elicitation process of over a dozen experts who knew a thing or two about hoary bats. We looked at various different demographic scenarios, so birth, death rates, longevity, those sorts of questions. And we looked at current estimated fatality rates and predicted fatality rates into the future. And the most likely model of this predicted a 90% decline of hoary bats within 50 years. Now, this was based on expert elicitation and a suite of fairly realistic demographic and fatality scenarios. Now, it doesn't include potential build-out. So I showed these images of increasing amount of wind energy on the ground. This did not include that. It held wind energy facilities constant, and it held kind of sort of that fatality rate constant. How many are being killed per year of the population? So what percentage of the population are being killed per year? We held those things constant, and we did not consider any sort of curtailment or mitigation of those fatality rates. So pretty simplistic model that was meant to kind of be hypothesis based. Under these scenarios, what could we predict, and what sort of solutions are there? This was followed up on just a few years ago by Friedenberg and Frick, and they did a much more extensive study considering curtailment, and considering mitigation, and considering different build-out scenarios. And they stated in this paper that current levels of wind energy build-out may have already caused substantial population declines. Under their lowest risk scenario of high maximum growth rate of the population and low wind energy build-out, the median simulated population of 2.25 million hoary bats experienced a 50% decline by 2028. Here's a figure from their work where they have a target reduction of bat fatalities at wind turbines to manage the risk of hoary bat declines. So here we have this risk type of a 50% decline by 2050. So if we want just a 50% decline by 2050, this is what this is looking at. And then this abundance in millions of how many hoary bats do we think are on the landscape? 1 million is not realistic. If we know from the number of bats that we've picked up so far that there are likely well more than 1 million bats, particularly these are hoary bats across North America. Realistically, we think there's somewhere between 2.25 and 4 million hoary bats. There may be up to 10 million, but if that were the case, we think we'd be swimming in hoary bats, which would be amazing because they're gorgeous. But we think that there's somewhere between 2.25 and 4 million hoary bats. If we want, if we expect there to be a low build out, so not as many turbines as predicted, then here we have lambda of 1.18, so that's a population growth rate of 18% per year, or a stable population of 1, so we just replace themselves. If the population growth rate is 1.18, and there's going to be low build out. And if there are 4 million bats, we don't really need to reduce the amount of bat fatality. So there's 0% reduction needed. But if lambda is 1 and there's not many turbines being built, we need a 93% reduction in the amount of fatalities if we want a 50% decline by 2050. If there are 2.25 million hoary bats and population's doing great, then we need a 35% reduction in the amount of hoary bats killed. If we want a 50% decline by 2025, if lambda is 1, we need a 100% reduction of the number of hoary bats killed if we would like just a 50% decline by 2050. Now that's under low build out. You can see under the high build out scenario, we had much steeper, a much greater degree of mitigation or curtailment to have a 50% reduction in the number of bats killed by 2050. So a few different scenarios there. So how do we think hoary bats are actually doing? So here are some models about what could happen in the future given build out and given population growth rates. But do we have any indication of how the populations are currently actually doing? So we have this scenario potentially of 90% decline within 50 years. But what we do see on the landscape, a paper that Robert Barkley and I have been working on for a while, we actually see, looking at how fatality rates are changing over time at wind energy facilities. So from the first year of build out to the last year of build out, do we see a change in the number of bats killed? We actually do. If we look at that, we see that fatality rates at turbines are changing over time. And mostly what we see is that fewer and fewer bats are being picked up at wind energy facilities over time across the US and Canada. When we look at long-term studies of both capture and acoustic detection rates, we see some mixed results. Overall, with hoary bats, we see a general decline in the number of hoary bats and acoustic detections, but not at every site. I know within the Cypress Hills, which is a beautiful hotspot for these bats on the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan in Canada, we actually see the number of these bats increasing over time. And I think that's because it's a great location and it's acting as a bit of a refugia. But so we do have these mixed results in this. Lots of declines in some locations, but increases in others. For example, we did see about a 2% decline per year in hoary bat detections in the Pacific Northwest, and this great study by Rodhouse et al. 2019. When we look at another sort of less biased sort of way of collecting data, when we look at rabies submission rates, here's across the US. So the number here, we look at the number, proportion of species, certain species. So what proportion of all bats that are submitted for rabies testing are of hoary bats? This has been used as a metric to measure bat population sizes for many, many years. And in this case, when we look at across all 3 species of migratory bats, we see declines across the board. Fewer and fewer and fewer hoary bats, in this particular example, are being submitted year over year for rabies testing. So in general, we kind of see through all of these different ways of indirectly measuring population sizes, we see declines of captures, of acoustic detections, of fatalities or monitoring in that way, and in submission for rabies. So this leads us to a variety of questions. If we are modeling, and if we were talking about just hoary bats, are they an appropriate umbrella species? We are treating them a bit like that. We've done all these population models of this. I've been presenting hoary bat data. Are they appropriate? Yes, they make up the bulk of the fatalities across North America, but we do have these other sites where we have other species. So this is kind of a first question in this wicked sort of problem if we try to untangle this. If we manage this issue just for hoary bats, will this manage the issue for all species? That's a wicked problem. Is this appropriate? We are kind of focusing on that as this, and we're hoping that if we solve the issue for hoary bats, other bat species will also be protected. But I don't know if that is accurate. But we have lots of other questions that are actively being considered that tie into sort of this wicked problem. How many bats are actually killed at wind energy facilities are injured but not actually killed. We call this like crippling bias. One of the ways in which bats are killed are through barotrauma, where their blood vessels or small capillaries or air sacs in their lungs can rupture when they encounter the low pressure systems that drive turbine blades. How many of those can fly away? Or if they are struck by the blade, can they crawl away and then they're not counted? Can they fly away and do they have ear damage? Do their eardrums rupture, example, through barotrauma, but they can fly away and they die later? We don't know that. So are we underestimating in some way? What if these decreases in population sizes lead to these demographic knock-on effects? I.e., what if there are fewer and fewer individuals, can they find each other to mate? And if there are fewer and fewer individuals on the ground, do we see decreases in their reproductive ability? And do we see then just population declines because of this lack of reproduction? So declines, something like an allele effect, like we saw with passenger pigeons or Atlantic cod. We know very little. I've talked, all of my data that I presented today are about onshore developments of bats, but more and more facilities are being built offshore. And what are going to be the effects of offshore development on bats? Much harder to quantify. If you're struck by a turbine in the ocean, it's really hard to pick up that carcass and quantify it. So what do we think will happen? Are bats actually offshore? Well, we have lots of monitoring that's been done offshore, and we do see that in the US, multiple different species have been detected foraging and migrating to 40 kilometers from shore. In Europe, where there has been offshore wind energy for a very, very long time, bats have been recorded foraging and roosting on turbines, as well as on oil and gas platforms up to 80 kilometers offshore. And we know from some really early naturalist records that hoary bats, eastern red bats, and silver-haired bats were found on masts on ships at sea. So sailors would find them, or exhausted bats collapsing on decks of boats. So we do know that they appear on ships at sea, they appear many kilometers away, and hoary bats are one of the only land mammals on many of these remote isles, like Galapagos and Hawaii. And we know that they have colonized, like Hawaii, they colonized 2 times, and they did colonize Galapagos. So we do know that they have the potential to travel far out into the oceans and seas. And so this issue isn't necessarily just a land-based issue, but could also be an offshore issue. So I talked early on about the need to reduce our fossil fuel consumption, to reduce the impacts of climate change, because climate change is probably one of the biggest challenges the world is facing right now. And we need this. So can we have this rosier picture of wind energy? I said very few environmental impacts of this, except perhaps bats. But can we get there? Can we make them better? And there are lots of ways in which we can make wind energy better. We can green up green energy. We can work towards solving this wicked problem. And one of the right now, the best way that we have, the best tool in our toolbox is something called operational curtailment. And now operational curtailment is shutting off turbines in certain wind speeds. We're curtailing their operation, limiting the amount of times they operate. Here, a pretty simple graph of bat activity. So that activity could be acoustic detections or sightings around turbines using infrared. And most of the studies that have been done at wind energy facilities have found that bat activity is most common in lower wind speeds. So wind speeds below about 8 meters per second. And so we see that in the bars. And we see on the dotted line, we see the actual ramp up of energy production. So in low wind speeds, turbines are producing very little energy, but that they do ramp up, they turn on, their cut-in speeds are variable, but we'll say around 4 meters per second. They cut in there and start producing electricity at that level. They ramp up over those lower wind speeds until they're fully producing energy. And if we raise that cut-in speed from when they turn on and start producing electricity, if we raise that cut-in speed, many dozens of studies have been done with this. If we raise that to between 5 meters per second and 6.5 meters per second, we know that we reduce overall bat fatalities by about 50%. And it costs on average about 1% of annual power production. Now, I say this, and I know that there's energy producers in the room, and I know that this number is an oversimplification. It's an average. It can vary based on the quality of the wind energy site itself. And again, these are big picture sorts of things. But we have a tool here that has been shown by dozens and dozens of studies across the globe that when we increase cut-in speeds, and so reduce the amount of time turbines operate in low wind speeds, we reduce the number of bats killed. It does reduce the amount of power that is produced, but by about 1 to 3%. So it works. We have other technologies that we can use as well to potentially replace operational curtailment, but I would suggest that we do it in addition to operational curtailment. We have lots of acoustic deterrents. We've had dozens of amazing studies. We have a study done by Weaver et al. That looked at this NRG system. Here we have a series of microphones mounted on top of a turbine that produce a suite of echolocation or ultrasonic signals, hopefully trying to make uncomfortable airspaces around turbines that bats don't want to enter, to deter them from interacting with the turbines or limiting the amount of time they interact with the turbines. This study showed an overall reduction of bat fatalities of between 38 and 61%. They reduced hoary bat fatalities by 62 to 95%. And these Brazilian free-tailed bats, or Pteridia brasiliensis, from between 41 and 67% reduction. Now, it did not reduce fatalities for all bat species. So it didn't reduce fatality for yellow bats or Laziaris iga, did not reduce fatalities for that. Other acoustic deterrent studies have had similar results, where some sites, they work really well, with some species they work really well in reducing fatalities, but some species, they increase fatalities. They may be more of an attractant than a deterrent. So currently, there is not a single system. This is just a snippet of the system, of many different types. So currently, we don't have a single system that produces results consistently across all the species complexes and all of the different sorts of locations. But there is a lot of potential here. There's just still a lot that we don't know. And we also don't know how long these systems will act as deterrents. Will bats become habituated to the sounds, or will attraction eventually override the attraction to turbines, eventually override the detraction provided by these? How long will they last in extreme environments or extreme weather conditions? We just don't have the answers for this. I think there's a great tool that we can use in conjunction with reliable technologies like operational curtailments, and we can tweak that. But we do have more and more tools coming into our toolbox. We have more and more studies done on what sort of sites that have higher fatality rates than others, so we can do better informed siting. We have lots of modeling being done as more and more data is being compiled, and we're looking at fatalities at a larger landscape level. What sort of things are we seeing there? Lots of people interested in habitat compensation. How many acres of forest do you need to set aside to compensate for 20 female hoary bats? That's a hard question. But we're seeing it in some locations like Hawaii, where this approach is being used. That is very challenging to get at. I don't know how many acres of forest a female hoary bat is worth. I can't answer that. I don't know if any of us can, but it is a potential tool in a toolbox. This isn't something easier to answer, I think, maybe for some bigger colonial species, some cave roosting species, where we may have a very discrete, important habitat features that we can protect. But for these species like hoary bats, silver-haired bats, and red bats that are distributed across the landscape in much broader fashions, that's much more challenging. We can start to look, it's also challenging, but we can start to look at managing fatalities and looking at cumulative effects. So not looking at fatality rates at a site-by-site or turbine-by-turbine metric and managing in this piecemeal sort of approach, or even managing the number of fatalities across a province. But maybe we need to start thinking about these like wildlife management units or hunting units, where we start managing fatalities at a migratory route scale, at an ecoregion scale, thinking at these broader scales, or these landscape level scales, like bats think at these larger scales, and managing impacts at a population sort of level. We need more work trying to understand or testing hypotheses about behavior and attraction. Why are bats interacting with turbines in the first place? Are they attracted? How far are they attracted from? How far can they sense them? What sort of sensory modalities are they using to see turbines and interact with turbines? And how do we use those bat senses themselves and the attractive forces? Can we decrease those? Can we make something else more attractive and pull bats away from turbines? Lots in this basic biology sort of sphere and ethology that we just don't understand. And we need to understand to better reduce the fatalities. And lastly, one of the big questions for me in this wicked problem of this interaction between who's in charge, what sort of policies do we implement, who governs this, what scale do we do it, how do we do it, how do we fund the research? We need wind energy. We need more and more of it to reduce our effects of climate change, which is a big issue for all sorts of biodiversity. So a question that gets asked a lot, and we should be asking ourselves, a hard question, this wicked problem, are hoary bats, as the umbrella species, are they just the cost of increasing wind energy development and reducing our reliance on fossil fuels? I say no, but we have to ask these hard questions of what are we willing to pay to protect by all sorts of biodiversity by reducing the effects of climate change. What are we willing to pay as a society, as a culture, as a community? As I said, in my case, I say, no, I don't think hoary bats are the cost. But what is the cost? And are we willing to pay it? So this is a wicked problem. And I think more and more people should be discussing the sorts of costs and what we are willing to pay. And I'm going to leave you with that really hard question, that really wicked problem that keeps me up at night. And it's kept me up at night for the 20 years that I've been working on this issue. And so I hope that I've prompted some questions and maybe some discussions. And I know I focused a lot on North America and I used hoary bats as an umbrella species. But if you have any questions about anything that I talked about, maybe any other species across North America, around the globe, we do have time for some questions. And if we don't get to your questions now, here's my email address. I'd really like to thank you all for attending. I'd love to thank Dana and Susan for inviting me, and my husband for being wrangling dogs this early morning. That I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, we have time for a few questions. If anyone has anything that they want to ask Dr. Baerwald or conversation that they want to start, feel free to raise your hand, put your question in the chat, and we will get to them accordingly. And thank you all for being here today. It's nice to see such a good crowd come in, and I'm sure we're all tuning in from different times and different time zones. So it's nice to see you all. Okay, so we got a question from James. So James, go ahead. You can either put your question in the chat or go ahead and ask.
James, I'm from Canadian Wildlife Federation. Thanks. That was super interesting and very valuable to hear. Great talk. I have a bunch of questions, but I think what I'll ask about informed siting. This is something we've thought about a little bit. Is there a lot of work, or has there been work done on kind of the movement patterns and migratory paths for these species? I know, it obviously follows the wind paths like migratory birds, but is there enough known that we could actually look at developing maps of where to not place turbines?
So first off, we don't actually know if they follow wind paths like migratory birds do. We hypothesize that they do, but we don't actually know that. There's been very little work done on bat migration. We don't know if they follow clear routes or not, to be honest. But there's been lots of work done at individual facilities about what sort of landscape features or habitat features may drive fatality rates. And the results from those are wildly disparate. Some sites, it's the more water there is, the higher the fatality rate. Some sites, it's the exact opposite. But we're getting, we have the ability now that there's more and more publicly available data, and there's larger and larger data sets that we can start to look at it at a broader scale. So I did a study working on it, still it has been submitted, looking around the facilities around the Great Lakes, in Ontario specifically, modeling landscape features at a variety of different distances from facilities. I looked at 5 kilometers, so I looked at 1 kilometer, 5 kilometers, and 25 kilometers. And turns out that the landscape features that matter are ones that are farther away from facilities. So rather than what habitat a facility is built on directly, it's more where are those facilities nestled on the landscape. And because you got to think like a bat, these are bats that can migrate easily 100 kilometers a night. So moving 25, 50 kilometers is nothing. And what we're starting to see when we do that, and there was a study done with very, very similar measures done in the States as well, just south of the Great Lakes, using many different sites. And we're starting to see some similar patterns there, that fatality rates at a per turbine basis are greater at sites located within agricultural areas. So actually areas where there are fewer trees kind of within 25 kilometers. So I think what's happening there maybe is that we're putting structures that may look like trees in untreed areas, and that may attract bats that like trees. And so we're starting to see these landscape patterns that emerge. And I think more and more of that work has to be done. So looking at all the facilities across, you're Canadian, so all these facilities across southwestern Alberta, all these facilities in a forest service region, for example, and getting at it at a 25 kilometer radius scale or 50 kilometer radius scale. That work is new, but I think pretty important. So that's how we're going to get at informed siting. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, good.
We did have a question in the chat, and it was about whether or not there was going to be a video posted later. So that since we did have a lot of people coming in while you were doing your talk, Erin, I will say again, this was recorded and this will be posted on YouTube probably by the end of the week. So if you came in a little bit later and or if you want to reference the material again, this will be posted online later. And we also had a comment from Kristen. Not a question, but thank you so much for the talk. It was really eye-opening, and it's sad to see the scale of the damage. Yes, I would agree with that. I think Erin would agree with that as well. We have a question from Jolie. Does a change in turbine operation times to reduce bat impacts affect other species, i.e., fewer bat fatalities equals more bird impacts? Question mark. So
when we reduce the amount of times that turbines are spinning, so when we curtail operations, we are curtailing the movement of the blades. Generally, generalizations, generally when the blades aren't moving, they're not killing things. I'm sure there's a nicer way of saying that, but if the blades aren't moving, they're not striking birds, for example. So I don't think, and I know that there's some people that are really intimate with the bird data here. I see you, Christy. That could talk a little bit more about curtailment for birds, but the bird issue is a little bit different. There are still a few 100,000 birds killed across North America every year by turbines, but it's spread across a wide variety of species, a few hundred species of birds. It's not concentrated to just a few species, and so the impacts are quite different. But in general, if you reduce the amount of time that the blades spin, then you reduce the amount of time that they are potentially lethal. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, we have just a couple more minutes. So do we have any last minute questions? If not, we will wrap things up. And And again, I guess while we potentially wait for some more questions to come in, I will also say again, for those that came in late, that our next GBATnet My Field for Dummies webinar talk is going to be presented by a representative from Bat1K over the topic of genomics. So please stay tuned for our flyer coming out on that later in the month, and it will be on November 8th. We do have another question from Joey. Are ground level acoustic detectors enough to determine whether hoary bats or bats in general are using an area as a migratory corridor? Do you need to put detectors higher into the air?
That's a great question. Ground level detectors are not sufficient enough to tell us whether bats are using that air. For migratory corridors, it's a little bit more challenging. You could see changes seasonally in bat activity, which could tell you something about whether or not they're using that area as a migratory corridor. Ground-based acoustics does not tell you anything about the risk of being killed at turbines. In that case, then you do need to get detectors up to the nacelle or that hub height into the area where the blades are actually moving. So ground-based detectors can tell you something about the general movement and activity of bats in the area and whether or not you see changes in migratory bat activity, but it does not, ground-based detectors do not reliably predict the number of bats that could be killed at wind energy facilities. It's kind of a two-part question and two-part answer. You're welcome.
All right, well, that kind of wraps up our webinar for today. So again, thank you to everyone for coming today. Thank you so much to Dr. Baerwald for being our speaker this morning. She got up very early for us today, 5:45 her time. So, so thank you so much, Erin, for speaking with all of us today and for doing such a great presentation.
Thank you so much for the invite. I'm going to have a nap before my lecture, I think.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks. See you.